So to kick off the second session, Amy asked me to talk a little bit about how design thinking aligns with library practice, but to also reflect a little bit on the barriers of adopting design thinking. Just for some background, so I'm passing around this toolkit that we created with the Gates Foundation in partnership with two libraries, Chicago Public Library and Aarhus Public Library based in Denmark. And if you haven't heard of that engagement, it's actually been a long-running one. So we've been working with them for about 2 or 3 years. And we're doing two things. One, which is to coach librarians on the ground in their libraries to think like designers. And then in the course of that, because you can't do that without, in the absence of having a project, in the course of that, we're actually running experiments and new service prototypes in those libraries. So we're doing those two things at once. And so we worked with 5 different teams across those 2 libraries over the past year and a half or so. So if you've read in the readings, and this is in the toolkit that I'm passing around as well, you've seen that design thinking is both a human-centered approach and a mindset to designing solutions for not only libraries, but many other industries and places. And I just want to point out the intent behind choosing these 2 particular words. So first, it's more of an approach and less a process. And so it's a way of doing something rather than a series of prescribed steps or actions that lead to a predetermined outcome, which I think is important to point out. And the second piece here is that it's a mindset, which I think is probably the more important piece, which is a new way to see and understand the world. And we call this being creatively confident. It's another term. Naive and optimistic. And so if you've seen this process or the approach laid out, there's 3 general modes of thinking. So the first one is this little triangle, which we call inspiration. It's about framing a challenge, going out into the world, and discovering new perspectives on a particular problem, or question. The second one is ideation. So based off of that challenge, generating a lot of ideas, making them tangible through prototypes, building things. And then lastly, iteration, which is a critical step. So you have to put your prototype out there in the world and iterate upon it with your users. And oftentimes with co-creation as one particular technique. So, and this is just one way to look at the approach. So I thought the readings were great and sort of opening up some criticism around how simple and clean this looks. So I thought I would bring out some other ways to visualize this. So it can look like this, which is essentially the same thing. It's a series of modes, which is about going out into the world, exploring and understanding, taking this sort of like cloudy fogginess of ideas and interviews and quotes and stories and synthesizing that into some insights. And then this squiggly line here is prototyping. So it's a very highly iterative process. You're trying different things out there in the world. You're trying to get to a solution that feels good for the question that you're asking. And then refining and scaling whatever that solution is. So it feels a little bit more nonlinear. It could also look like this in a really simple format. So this is kind of what, John, you were talking about with kind of the spiral idea of what are the cycles of divergence and convergence that you can put in place in your organization that is about creating lots of different choices, lots of possibilities, and then also filtering and thinking about what are the right choices and narrowing down. So it's constantly this sort of divergent, convergent process over and over. Could also look like this. This one makes our clients especially nervous, which is called the Squiggle, which is this process of uncertainty of going out into the world and getting all this data, hearing all these stories, and from that fog of synthesis, seeing what are the opportunities that are most rich for impact. And my point here is just to say that I think it's a lot messier and more chaotic sometimes than what's represented in a diagram of design thinking, but we've portrayed it as something that's fairly straightforward in the toolkit, just as an invitation for people to not feel too intimidated and to just try something out using these methods. It's not easy either. IDEO gives away all of our methods for free. I think if it were easy, we would be out of business. It's challenging, and I think the only way to actually learn what this process is to actually start doing it. So I believe it's worth trying in libraries, and I have 3 reasons why. So first, I think libraries are this great living lab. You wouldn't believe how many of our private sector clients would kill to have a space dedicated with a steady stream of users, research specimens that you can observe and ask questions of and experiment with on a day-to-day basis. The beauty of the library is that you have that in front of you every day. And so this is an example from the 4th floor at Chattanooga Public Library, which is really great, where design thinking can really fire on all 4 cylinders. You can do live prototypes, you can conduct short cycles of experimentation with this really ready audience that's already there, and you can co-create with diverse users. And then secondly, I believe librarians are really great service designers. We get this question, like, what is the future of libraries? And my colleagues and I always say librarians, because they're the people who hold the keys to the community. They really know the users the best. And so if there's anyone who's well suited to be able to evolve what a library is and to address the needs that are out there, it's the librarians themselves. And so we discussed this in this first session, but how do we empower frontline employees in a really distributed way, those individuals to feel like they can actually create better solutions? And that's what this toolkit is for. And then third, and John, you touched upon this, libraries are networked community infrastructure. So, if libraries are at the center of community strength and resilience, they connect education and learning systems, public safety, economic development, civic engagement. I think that the solutions that arise from design thinking, the best ones are highly systemic, complex, and cross institutions. So as libraries in the center of all those institutions, they are very well positioned to be able to connect, make those partnerships happen. They probably already have them. It's just about being able to activate them. And so they can actually carry out some of those big, larger innovations that are quite systemic. Amy also asked me to touch on some of the barriers based off of my experience working with Chicago and with Aarhus. These are just a few that are very, very blanket organization or generalizations, and I think that they really depend on the library and the place. But so here are some tensions that I would just call out. So I lead our public sector practice in our Chicago office of IDEO, and so in the public sector generally, you can imagine that government should work, and it should work all the time, and it should be consistently delivering services without fail. So in a sense, it's about reflecting upon historical data and benchmarking, things like that. Versus on the right here, design thinkers are about making a future feel more real now. So design thinking is about imagining possibilities. Another tension is about research. So research in a library context tends to be, not always, sometimes, about answering questions. So basically, a patron comes up to you and has an idea about research, and you want to be able to provide answers. Research in design thinking is about opening up new questions and being able to be comfortable with ambiguity throughout the entire approach. Third, so I find that I think a lot of organizations, and Mary, you touched upon this, which is, they're very much, libraries tend to be based and structured with these operational teams. And one of the challenges, I think, is being able to create a core team of diverse disciplines and have them be the driving force behind the organization. So how do you have an organization that's driven by strategic teams that are multidisciplinary? And then, failure is scary. So, failure is avoided sometimes in organizations like this versus in the design thinking approach, failure is invited because you get to the next iteration and the next solution all the more quickly. So I think what we're going to talk about in this next session is a couple different ways to resolve these tensions, or at least to move on from these challenges. And I would just offer a couple of thought starters in that direction. So we talked a little bit about this, Siobhan, you mentioned hiring. So one of the things that I think is interesting is, so at IDEO we say that we hire T-shaped people, which is to have one depth in a particular area, and the top part of the T is an affinity towards others. So what you get is a really diverse, talented group of people who happen to play well with others. And so one of the things that we're doing more and more often, actually, that I've noticed is we're hiring X-shaped people. So people who have a depth or expertise in two different industries or disciplines, and they can kind of own where that intersection is. This is a little bit about what Walter was saying yesterday with art and science. It's like, who are the people who can do both? And so those are interesting people who I think will be leaders of change within organizations like libraries. And then lastly, I'll leave you with this, which is just a reframing on innovation itself, which is one of the things that in my experience talking with CPL and with Aarhus, innovation is a really scary word. And so I think one of the things that can dispel some of the myths around that is by saying that it's a verb, it's a constant act of doing. It's just like how a strategic plan isn't concrete, it's strategic planning all the time. And it's not always new. It might be about taking the shiny object that you see somewhere else and making it appropriately contextualized to your library. And I would consider that to be innovation, because it's about reading context. And so this equation up here, our Chief Creative Officer, Paul Bennett, likes to refer to a bunch. It's this thesis that change happens not at a large scale top-down, but by empowering people at a very kind of frontline level to think differently and then create lots and lots of small experiments that eventually bubble up to a large-scale movement, a big innovation. And recently, we've actually talked about adding another part of this equation, which is small times many divided by or over tomorrow plus doable. So it's also getting to the execution factor too, right? So all of those ingredients will then kind of snowball into a bigger scale shift.